Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance of the military transport plane, her worn duffel bag clutched tightly in her weathered hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Joint Base Andrews, and the smell of jet fuel filled the crisp October air. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 months, ever since she received the emergency call about her son. The young airman at the boarding ramp looked at her with barely concealed annoyance. His crisp uniform and polished boots screamed of someone who had never seen real combat, never felt the weight of life and death decisions pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see your authorization papers again," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that young military personnel often used when they wanted to feel important. "This is a military transport, not a commercial flight." Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the folded documents for what felt like the 100th time that morning. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the barely controlled anger that had been building inside her since this whole ordeal began. The papers were official, stamped with all the right seals, signed by all the right people. But somehow, that didn't seem to matter to the young man standing between her and the plane that would take her to Germany, where her son lay fighting for his life in a military hospital. "These look irregular," the airman said, after studying the papers with exaggerated care. "I'm not sure I can allow you to board without additional verification." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had jumped through every hoop, navigated every bureaucratic maze, called in every favor she had left from her years of service. Her son, Staff Sergeant David Mitchell, had been critically injured in a training accident at Ramstein Air Base. The doctors said the next 48 hours would determine whether he would survive the traumatic brain injury that had left him unconscious for over a week. "Listen, son," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "My boy is dying in a hospital bed 5,000 miles from here. These papers are legitimate and you know it. Every seal, every signature, every authorization code is exactly where it should be." The airman shifted uncomfortably, but his expression remained stubbornly defiant. "Ma'am, I understand your situation, but regulations are regulations. Without proper verification, I cannot allow unauthorized personnel onto a military aircraft." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had seen that look before, in the eyes of young soldiers who were more concerned with following rules than understanding their purpose. It was the same look she had encountered countless times during her own military career, when bureaucracy became more important than humanity. "Unauthorized personnel?" The words came out as a whisper, but they carried the weight of 25 years of military service. "Son, do you have any idea who you're talking to?" The airman's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I don't care if you're the president's mother. Without proper authorization, you're not getting on this plane." Other passengers had begun to notice the commotion. A few officers in dress uniforms glanced over with mild curiosity, while enlisted personnel tried to pretend they weren't listening to what was clearly becoming a heated exchange. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, could sense their discomfort with the situation, but no one stepped forward to help. She thought about her son, lying in that hospital bed with machines keeping him alive. David had been her whole world since his father died in Afghanistan 12 years ago. She had watched him grow from a grief-stricken boy into a strong, dedicated soldier who served his country with the same passion that had driven her throughout her own career. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Here she was, being denied passage on a military aircraft by someone who probably wasn't even born when she first put on a uniform. The scar on her left cheek, a permanent reminder of a mortar explosion in Iraq, seemed to throb with each heartbeat. "Please," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I've given everything to this country. My husband died serving it. My son is dying serving it. All I'm asking is for a ride to be with him." The airman's expression softened for just a moment, but then his training kicked in and his face hardened again. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about your family's service and sacrifice, but I have my orders. These papers don't look right to me, and I won't risk my career for anyone." Sarah stared at him, seeing not just a stubborn young man, but a system that had somehow lost sight of its own values. She thought about all the times she had put her life on the line, all the nights she had spent in foxholes and forward operating bases, all the friends she had lost and the wounds she had carried. And now, when she needed that same system to help her reach her dying son, it was failing her. The aircraft engines began to spool up, their whining pitch growing higher as the pilots prepared for departure. Time was running out, and Sarah felt panic beginning to creep into her chest. She had to get on that plane. Her son needed her, and she had already lost too much time dealing with paperwork and red tape. "Airman," she said, her voice taking on the tone she had once used to command respect from soldiers under her command. "I need you to step aside and let me board this aircraft. Right now." The young man's hand moved instinctively toward the radio clipped to his shoulder. "Ma'am, if you don't step away from the aircraft, I'm going to have to call security." The threat hung in the air between them like a physical thing. Sarah could see the determination in his eyes, the stubborn belief that he was doing the right thing by following protocol. She wanted to scream at him, to shake him until he understood that sometimes rules needed to bend in the face of human need. But she also knew that causing a scene would only make things worse. Other passengers continued to file past them, some casting sympathetic glances her way, others studiously avoiding eye contact. The loading process was nearly complete, and Sarah realized with growing desperation that she might actually be left behind. The scar on her cheek, barely visible unless someone looked closely, seemed to burn as memories of how she had earned it flooded back. The explosion that had nearly killed her, the months of recovery, the way people looked at her differently afterward. She had worn that scar as a badge of honor, proof of her service and sacrifice, but now it felt like just another mark of how the system had failed her. "Final boarding call," came a voice from inside the aircraft. "All passengers aboard, prepare for departure." Sarah looked at the airman one last time, seeing in his young face all the bureaucratic obstacles that had defined her struggle over the past 3 months. She had followed every rule, filled out every form, made every required phone call, and still, she stood on the wrong side of that aircraft door, separated from her son by thousands of miles and one stubborn young man who couldn't see past his clipboard. The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved conflict. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, might not be enough to get her to her son's bedside in time. The aircraft door began to close, and Sarah felt something break inside her chest. She had faced enemy fire, survived explosions, and buried her husband. But the thought of losing her son while being held back by red tape was almost more than she could bear. Just as despair began to overwhelm her, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps behind her, heavy, measured steps that spoke of authority and experience. Someone was coming, and something about the way the airman's expression suddenly changed told her that this new arrival might be exactly what she needed. The footsteps stopped just behind her, and Sarah felt a presence that commanded immediate attention. Without turning around, she knew that someone important had just joined their confrontation. The airman's eyes widened slightly, and his hand moved away from his radio as he came to attention. "Is there a problem here, Airman?" The voice behind her was deep, authoritative, and carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Sarah turned slowly, her heart still pounding from the stress of the confrontation. What she saw standing behind her would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. The man wore the stars of a general officer, and his weathered face spoke of decades of military service. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, intelligent and sharp, taking in every detail of the situation with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen it all. The general's eyes moved from the airman to Sarah, and then, almost imperceptibly, they focused on the small scar that marked her left cheek. For just a moment, his expression changed, as if he were seeing something that others had missed. General William Hayes had been walking across the tarmac when he noticed the commotion near the transport aircraft. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a routine boarding dispute, the kind of minor bureaucratic tangle that happened dozens of times each day at military installations around the world. But something about the woman's posture, the way she held herself despite obvious distress, had caught his attention. As he drew closer, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful control she was exercising over her emotions. It was a stance he recognized, one that spoke of military training and hard-won discipline. The young airman was clearly following protocol, but there was something about his rigid adherence to rules that rubbed the general the wrong way. "Is there a problem here, Airman?" he asked, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from 4 decades of military service. The airman snapped to attention so quickly that his clipboard nearly fell from his hands. "General Hayes, sir. This civilian is attempting to board the transport without proper authorization. Her papers appear to be irregular, and I was just explaining that—" "At ease, son," General Hayes interrupted gently. "Let me take a look at those papers." Sarah turned to face him, and that's when he saw it. The scar on her left cheek was faint but unmistakable, a jagged line that told a story of violence and survival. But it wasn't just any scar. The general had seen that exact mark before, in classified briefings and commendation reports. His eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. "Ma'am, may I see your identification?" he asked, his tone respectful but urgent. Sarah handed over her military ID card, her hands steadier now despite the confusion in her eyes. General Hayes studied it carefully, comparing the face before him with the photograph on the card. His expression grew more serious with each passing second. "Sarah Mitchell," he read aloud, then looked up at her with something approaching awe. "Sergeant Major Sarah Mitchell, retired, Medal of Honor recipient." The words hit the tarmac like a thunderbolt. The airman's face went pale as the implications of what the general had just said sank in. Other military personnel within earshot stopped what they were doing and turned to stare. A Medal of Honor recipient was standing right there, and she had been denied boarding by a junior enlisted man. "Sir, I didn't know," the airman began, but General Hayes held up a hand to silence him. "Airman, do you know what the Medal of Honor represents?" the general asked, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing a particularly slow student. "Yes, sir. It's the highest military decoration awarded for valor in action against an enemy force." "That's correct. And do you know how Sergeant Major Mitchell earned hers?" The airman shook his head, his face now flushed with embarrassment and growing comprehension of his mistake. General Hayes looked at Sarah, seeing not just the woman standing before him, but the legend she had become in certain military circles. Her story was one that was told in hushed tones in officer clubs and training academies, a tale of extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. 15 years ago, Sergeant Major Mitchell was serving as a senior NCO with the 82nd Airborne in Iraq. Her unit came under heavy mortar attack while conducting a humanitarian aid distribution in a small village outside Baghdad. A mortar round hit the compound where they were working, collapsing part of the building and trapping 17 civilians, including 8 children, under the rubble. The general's voice carried clearly across the tarmac, and more military personnel had begun to gather, drawn by the unfolding story. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the center of such attention. The enemy fire was so intense that the rest of her unit had to take cover behind their vehicles, But Sergeant Major Mitchell didn't hesitate. She ran into that collapsed building under constant enemy fire and began pulling people out one by one. She made trip after trip into that death trap, even after taking shrapnel to the face from an exploding mortar round. The general gestured toward the scar on Sarah's cheek, and everyone present understood its significance. It wasn't just a mark of injury, it was a badge of incredible heroism. By the time she was done, she had saved all 17 civilians, including a pregnant woman and her newborn baby. But she didn't stop there. When her unit's medic was wounded, she provided emergency medical care under fire for over an hour until reinforcements arrived. She saved 34 lives that day and nearly lost her own doing it. The silence that followed was deafening. The airman looked as if he wanted to disappear into the ground, while the other military personnel stared at Sarah with a mixture of respect and amazement. Many of them had heard the story before, but few had ever expected to meet the woman behind it. Sarah felt deeply uncomfortable with the attention. She had never sought recognition for her actions that day in Iraq, and she certainly didn't want to use her medal as a way to get special treatment. But her son was dying, and if her service record could get her to his bedside, then she would accept the scrutiny. "General," she said quietly, "I appreciate your recognition of my service, but I'm not looking for special treatment. I just need to get to my son. He's in critical condition at Ramstein, and the doctors say—" "You don't need to explain," General Hayes interrupted gently. "I know about your son's situation. I also know that you've been fighting through bureaucratic red tape for 3 months trying to get to him." Sarah looked surprised. "You know about David?" The general nodded grimly. "Staff Sergeant David Mitchell, 75th Ranger Regiment. Traumatic brain injury sustained during a training accident. His condition has been deteriorating, and the medical team has requested family presence." The fact that a general officer knew about her son's condition both surprised and alarmed Sarah. It suggested that David's injuries were even more serious than she had been told, serious enough to warrant high-level attention. "Ma'am, what happened to you today is inexcusable," General Hayes continued, his voice hardening as he turned to address the wider audience that had gathered. "This woman is a genuine American hero, and she has been denied boarding because of bureaucratic incompetence and a failure to recognize the significance of her sacrifice." The airman looked ready to faint. His career was flashing before his eyes as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Denying passage to a Medal of Honor recipient was the kind of blunder that could end a military career before it really began. "Airman Rodriguez," General Hayes said, reading the young man's name tag, "you will personally escort Sergeant Major Mitchell to the aircraft and ensure she has every comfort available during her flight. You will also prepare a full written report explaining how this situation occurred and what steps will be taken to prevent it from happening again." "Yes, sir," the airman replied, his voice cracking slightly with stress. But General Hayes wasn't finished. He turned back to Sarah, and his expression softened. "Ma'am, I want you to know that your son's medical team at Ramstein is the best in the world. Colonel Martinez, who's overseeing his care, served under me in Afghanistan. He's a good man and an excellent doctor." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes for the first time since this ordeal began. After months of fighting through bureaucracy and red tape, someone finally understood the urgency of her situation. "Thank you, General. I can't express how much this means to me." "No thanks necessary, ma'am. It's the least this country can do for someone who has given so much." The general paused, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. "I want you to call me personally if you encounter any other obstacles, any other problems with getting the care and support your family deserves. My direct line is on that card." Sarah took the card with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the kindness and respect being shown to her. It was such a contrast to the treatment she had received over the past few hours. "There's something else," General Hayes said, lowering his voice so that only Sarah could hear. "Your son's unit has been asking about him constantly. His squad leader, Sergeant First Class Thompson, has been camped out at the hospital for 5 days straight. Your boy is well loved by his fellow soldiers." The words brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. She had raised David to be the kind of man who earned the respect and loyalty of those around him, and knowing that his fellow Rangers cared enough to maintain a vigil at his bedside filled her with pride despite her fear. "The aircraft is ready for departure," came an announcement from the plane's crew chief. "All passengers please board immediately." General Hayes gestured toward the aircraft. "Sergeant Major, your chariot awaits." As they walked toward the plane, the general continued to speak quietly with Sarah. "I want you to know that the Army is taking care of everything regarding your son's medical expenses and your travel costs. You won't receive any bills, and if anyone tries to charge you for anything related to this situation, you call me immediately." Sarah nodded, too emotional to trust her voice. The kindness and efficiency with which General Hayes was handling her situation stood in stark contrast to the months of frustration she had endured trying to navigate the military bureaucracy. As they reached the aircraft's steps, the general stopped and saluted her. It was a gesture of respect from one warrior to another, a recognition of her service and sacrifice that transcended rank and protocol. "Give my regards to your son when he wakes up," he said. "Tell him that General Hayes says Rangers lead the way." Sarah returned the salute, her years of military training taking over despite her civilian clothes. "Thank you, sir, for everything." She boarded the aircraft to find that the crew chief had prepared the most comfortable seat available and had arranged for special meal service during the flight. Other passengers, now aware of her identity and story, nodded respectfully as she passed, but gave her the privacy she needed to process everything that had happened. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Sarah looked out the window and saw General Hayes still standing on the tarmac, watching their departure. She realized that her encounter with him had been more than just a stroke of luck. It had been a reminder that there were still people in the military who understood what service and sacrifice really meant. The flight to Germany felt both endless and too short. Sarah stared out the window at the Atlantic Ocean passing below, her mind racing between memories of her son's childhood and fears about what she might find at the hospital. The crew had been exceptionally kind, bringing her regular updates on their flight progress and ensuring she had everything she needed for the 10-hour journey. Somewhere over the North Sea, Sarah finally allowed herself to think about what General Hayes had said. Her son was surrounded by people who cared about him, fellow soldiers who were maintaining a vigil at his bedside. It reminded her of the bonds she had formed during her own military service, connections that went deeper than friendship and approached the level of family. When the aircraft finally touched down at Ramstein Air Base, Sarah felt her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and dread. The crew chief personally escorted her off the plane and helped her with her luggage, treating her with the kind of respect typically reserved for visiting dignitaries. A staff car was waiting for her on the tarmac, with a young lieutenant behind the wheel. "Sergeant Major Mitchell?" he asked as she approached. "I'm Lieutenant Peterson. General Hayes called ahead and asked me to take you directly to the hospital." The drive through the German countryside would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Rolling hills covered with autumn foliage stretched in every direction, and quaint villages dotted the landscape like scenes from a storybook. But Sarah barely noticed any of it. Her focus was entirely on the growing outline of the hospital complex in the distance. Lieutenant Peterson tried to make conversation during the drive, but he seemed to understand that Sarah needed time to prepare herself mentally for what she was about to face. Instead, he provided practical information about the hospital and her son's medical team. "Colonel Martinez is one of the best neurosurgeons in the military," he said as they approached the hospital entrance. "He's been working around the clock on your son's case. The whole medical team has, actually. The hospital was a modern, efficient-looking building that could have been transplanted from any major American city. But as they pulled up to the main entrance, Sarah could see that this was no ordinary medical facility. Military personnel in various uniforms moved purposefully through the corridors visible through the glass windows, and security was obviously tight. Lieutenant Peterson escorted her through the admission process, which had clearly been streamlined in advance. Within minutes, Sarah found herself being led through sterile hospital corridors toward the intensive care unit where her son was being treated. "His room is just around this corner," the lieutenant said gently. "Colonel Martinez is waiting to speak with you before you see him." Colonel Martinez turned out to be a compact, serious-looking man in his 50s, with kind eyes and the calm demeanor that Sarah associated with experienced military medical professionals. He greeted her with a firm handshake and the kind of direct honesty she appreciated. "Sergeant Major Mitchell, I want to prepare you for what you're going to see," he said without preamble. "Your son has been unconscious for 9 days now. He's stable, but his brain injury was severe. We've done everything we can surgically, and now it's really a matter of waiting to see how his brain responds to the treatment." Sarah nodded, steeling herself for what was to come. "Can I see him now?" "Of course. But I want you to know that we believe hearing familiar voices can help patients in his condition. Talk to him. Tell him stories. Let him know you're here." The colonel led her to a room filled with medical equipment that seemed to dwarf the still figure lying in the hospital bed. David looked smaller than she remembered, and far younger than his 28 years. Tubes and wires connected him to various machines that beeped and hummed with electronic precision. But what struck Sarah most was how peaceful he looked. The last time she had seen him, during his brief leave 6 months ago, he had been full of energy and laughter, planning his next deployment and talking about his girlfriend back home. Now he lay motionless, his face relaxed in a way that reminded her of when he was a child. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered, taking his hand in hers. "Mama's here." She spent the next several hours simply sitting beside his bed, talking to him about everything and nothing. She told him about her flight, about General Hayes, about the flowers blooming in her garden back home. She shared memories of his childhood, reminding him of family camping trips and the time he tried to teach their dog to salute. As evening approached, a commotion in the hallway caught her attention. Through the window, she could see a group of soldiers in combat uniforms approaching the ICU. The nurses were trying to maintain quiet, but it was clear that these men were determined to check on their fallen comrade. A tall, rugged-looking sergeant appeared in the doorway, his face showing the strain of days without proper sleep. "Ma'am, are you David's mother?" he asked quietly. "Yes, I'm Sarah Mitchell." "Sergeant First Class Thompson, ma'am. I've been leading David's squad." He paused, clearly struggling with emotion. "We wanted you to know that we're all here for whatever you need. He's one of the best soldiers I've ever served with, and one of the best men I've ever known." Over the next few hours, a steady stream of Rangers came by to pay their respects. Each one had a story to share about David's courage, his humor, his willingness to help his fellow soldiers. Sarah began to see a picture of the man her son had become, viewed through the eyes of those who served alongside him. "He talked about you all the time, ma'am," said a young specialist who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. "Always bragging about his hero mom and how she raised him to be strong. He carries a picture of you in your uniform in his wallet." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had always worried that her military service had somehow cheated David of a normal childhood, that the demands of her career had prevented her from being the mother he deserved. But hearing these young soldiers talk about how proud he was of her service, how her example had shaped his own values, filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. On the third day of her vigil, something changed. Sarah was reading aloud from one of David's favorite books when she felt his hand twitch in hers. She looked up to see his eyes fluttering open, confused and unfocused, but definitely aware. "David," she whispered, afraid to believe what she was seeing. "Mom?" His voice was barely audible, but it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. The medical team rushed in within seconds, alerted by the monitoring equipment that their patient was regaining consciousness. Colonel Martinez performed a quick neurological assessment while Sarah held her breath, praying that her son's mind was intact. "Welcome back, Staff Sergeant," the doctor said with a smile. "You've been asleep for quite a while." David's recovery was slow but steady. The brain injury had affected his short-term memory and would require months of rehabilitation, but his core personality remained unchanged. He was still the thoughtful, courageous young man Sarah had raised, still the dedicated soldier his squad mates respected and admired. 2 weeks later, as David was being prepared for medical transport back to the United States, he asked his mother about something that had been puzzling him. "Mom, the nurses keep telling me that some general intervened to get you on the flight to Germany. They're acting like it was a big deal, but they won't tell me exactly what happened." Sarah looked at her son, seeing in his eyes the same integrity and humility that had defined his character since childhood. She thought about the young airman who had tried to deny her boarding, about General Hayes's intervention, about the recognition her scar had finally brought her after years of trying to forget that day in Iraq. "It's not important, sweetheart," she said, squeezing his hand. "What matters is that I was able to be here when you needed me." But David persisted, and eventually Sarah found herself telling him the whole story. She watched his expression change as he learned about her confrontation at the aircraft, about the Medal of Honor citation that had secured her passage, about the general who had recognized her sacrifice and ensured she could reach her son's bedside. When she finished, David was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice filled with emotion. "I always knew you were a hero, Mom, but hearing about how you fought to get to me, about how your service opened doors when I needed you most, I've never been prouder to be your son." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than fear. Her son was alive. He was going to recover, and the bonds between them had been strengthened rather than broken by their ordeal. The flight home was everything the flight to Germany had not been. David was conscious and alert, surrounded by a medical team that had become like family during his recovery. Sarah sat beside his stretcher, marveling at the resilience that had carried him through his darkest hours. As their aircraft approached American airspace, Sarah thought about General Hayes and the difference one person's intervention had made. She thought about the young airman who had learned a valuable lesson about looking beyond paperwork to see the human stories behind military service. Most of all, she thought about her son and the knowledge that their family's tradition of service would continue, strengthened by the bonds forged in crisis. The scar on her cheek no longer felt like a mark of pain. Instead, it had become what it was always meant to be, a symbol of sacrifice, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between those who serve their country and the families who support them. Sometimes, Sarah reflected, it takes a moment of crisis to remind us that our scars tell stories of survival, and that service to others is never forgotten, even when we think it has been overlooked. When they landed at Walter Reed Medical Center, where David would continue his rehabilitation, Sarah noticed a familiar figure waiting on the tarmac. General Hayes stood at attention as the aircraft door opened, ready to welcome home two heroes whose bond had been tested and proven unbreakable. The general's presence was a reminder that in the military, family extends beyond blood relations to encompass all those who wear the uniform and the loved ones who support them. Sarah's journey from denied boarding to honored passenger had become a story that would be told and retold, a reminder that sometimes the most important interventions come from those who understand the true meaning of service and sacrifice. As they transferred David to the waiting ambulance, Sarah looked back at the aircraft that had carried them home. She thought about all the journeys that had brought them to this moment, all the challenges they had overcome together. Her son was alive, her family was whole, and her service had finally received the recognition it deserved. Not because she had sought it, but because it had been exactly what she needed when she needed it most. The scar on her cheek caught the late afternoon sunlight as she smiled, and for the first time in years, Sarah Mitchell felt truly at peace with her past, present, and future.